can join as we begin talking. So good afternoon and welcome to Uptown Consortium's virtual event. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing effort to engage with the Uptown community, so thank you so much for joining us. For today's discussion, we've partnered with UC Health to share updates about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and UC Health's current renovations related to its master plan. President and CEO, Dr. Rick Lofgren, will discuss how the medical system is responding to the pandemic, tips for flu season, and progress in COVID-19 vaccine trials. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Rick Lofgren is President and CEO of UC Health, the University of Cincinnati's affiliated health system. UC Health, with more than 11,000 employees, physicians, and advanced practice providers, comprises University of Cincinnati Medical Center, Westchester Hospital, Daniel Drake Center for Post-Acute Care, Lindner Center of Hope, and more than 30 outpatient service locations in 3 states. As one of the advisors to Ohio Governor Mike DeWine during the pandemic response, Dr. Lofgren brings a unique perspective as the leader of Greater Cincinnati's academic health system and as an internal medicine physician with a master's degree in epidemiology. Additionally, Dr. Lofgren holds leadership roles with the Ohio Hospital Association, the Greater Cincinnati Health Collaborative, and the Cincinnati's Chambers Restart Program. Locally, Dr. Lofgren serves on several boards, including the board of Uptown Consortium, Inc. After Dr. Lofgren presents today, we'll have time for Q&A where Dr. Lofgren will answer questions our attendees have submitted in advance of today's presentation. So with all of that being said, I'm going to let Dr. Lofgren share his screen and give us a presentation today and an overview of the happenings during COVID-19 in UC Health. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I think you covered my first 3 slides, or I was going to cover it. No, but I want to take a moment to thank Uptown for giving us the opportunity to talk today. And quite honestly, it turns out probably even more timely than I'd originally thought, as there's been some changes in with the sort of status of COVID in our community that I would like to spend a little time talking about as we think about this going in from the into the fall and into the winter season. So I am going to try to share my slides here. Hopefully that all came through.
Yes, looks great.
All right. So again, I appreciate having the time to meet with all of you. At UC Health, you know, one of the things as the academic health system for the region, our purpose is actually fairly simple: to advance healing and to reduce suffering. We really see our important vision of being the premier academic referral center, taking care of the most people with the most advanced and complex challenges and things that I think we're uniquely positioned to do that really requires that academic backbone. And what we've depicted here is the importance of our values and really recognizing first and foremost that the needs of our patients come first in terms of everything we do every day. You know, academic medicine has a unique role, and we recognize that as the only adult academic health system, we have both a unique opportunity and I would tell you an obligation in serving our community. And one of the important elements is really bringing unique programs that really requires not only specialists, but subspecialists and teams of subspecialists working in concert. And really needs to be in that ecosystem that only an academic environment can create, with learners challenging and pushing new knowledge, as well as the access to the latest clinical research, which of course needs to have access to the latest translational research and basic science research. And so we really recognize that that's our important role in our community. Then, as Brooke mentioned, I won't go through these since they're covered, but just to give you some context of the organization, we have just about 12,000 team members, over 10,000 direct employees, work with another nearly 1,000 physicians from UC physicians, as well as trainees in terms of residents and fellows, as well as almost over 400 nurse practitioners and the like. 4 campuses, a number of outpatient locations, and have over 1,100 beds in our community, which translates into over 2 million visits, nearly 50,000 hospital discharges, over 120,000 emergency visits. We have 11,000 individuals who are transferred from other facilities to our facility to really gain access to those teams of subspecialists every year. And one of the things that I would note is being the clinical engine to support the academic mission of the university. We have a number of clinical trials in progress and have a long tradition of having nearly 1,000 clinical trials at any one point in time. And obviously have spent in the recent months pivoting and really focusing and being very active in the involvement of a number of clinical trials as it relates to both the diagnosis and treatment of COVID as we move forward. So I think by now everybody has seen the spiked animal on the right-hand part of the slide of the COVID virus. And just to briefly review, as I'm sure many of you now know, is that this is a virus, frankly, not all that different from the virus from the common cold, but this particular strain has never been seen in humans before, so that everybody in the world was actually potentially at risk of acquiring the infection. Like a lot of other respiratory infections, the main way in which you really acquire the infection is person-to-person contact, physical contact with somebody who is infected. There, in turn, their hands, which you shake or whatever, is infected. Again, the most important element really is by respiratory droplets, meaning the little spittles every time you speak, ones that you can't see, actually can land on an individual, get into a surface, particularly the eyes, mouth, and nose, and can acquire the infection. You also can get the infection by touching contaminated surfaces and then touching your mouth or your face. Many of us, I don't think, really realize how often we touch our face during the course of a day until this infection became really evident. Again, I think it's important, all those modes are important, but the respiratory droplet one and really contact with people who may be infected, spreading is really the most important way, which is why, in the end, social distancing and wearing a mask is the most effective way in which we have to control this virus. As I've said before, we can't at this point eradicate the virus. We certainly can't hide from it forever, but we do have to figure out how we can live with it and keep our lives open and still recognize that this virus is in our community. And we spend a little time sharing that information. What you have here on the slide also, if you see in the left hand, are the symptoms of COVID-19. And again, I think reflects the ever-changing and evolving knowledge we have. When we first were introduced to this virus, we really thought that the only real symptoms were fevers, cough, and shortness of breath. And if you didn't have those particular symptoms, it was unlikely that you were infected. Now, we now know that a number of people won't have any symptoms at all, but also can have a number of other sort of less discrete kind of problems, sore throat, fatigue, which makes it difficult to really understand who may be infected. Interesting, in the middle of that list of things that can cause it, one of the things I think is quite unique about this virus is the unique problem of causing a loss of taste and smell, which actually has been pretty specific for COVID-19 patients. Unique element, interesting enough, a number of the researchers at the University of Cincinnati are really looking into this unique feature about the disease. As many of you know, we've had over 35 million people worldwide now infected, over 7 million people in the United States. In the Cincinnati region, it's been over 31,000 individuals. And unfortunately, as a country, we did pass the 200,000 mark for the number of deaths in the nation. I mean, I also add, unfortunately, in Ohio, we recently crossed the domain of actually having over 5,000 Ohioans who've also lost their lives to this virus since its onset. And this just represents the cases. Again, this is about a week old. I apologize, but it really does just speak to the fact that we've had this wave of cases. One of the things that I know that I look at in terms of trying to understand the spread and the impact of COVID in our community is not only the number of cases, but in some respects, more so the number of hospitalizations. As we get better at detecting cases, some of the uptick in cases is because we're testing more and we find more and more asymptomatic people. But really, keeping track of the number of people then who are sick enough to get hospitalized is a pretty static number, where I think does give us a reflection about what's going on in the community. And what you see when the virus is first introduced, I'm looking on the right-hand side where it says hospitalization, 16,000. We saw a marked uptick in terms of hospitalizations in the early part of, latter part of March, into April as the virus was introduced, came back down through June, had an early spike this summer. In some respects, I'll show you in a minute, probably related to opening up sort of the bars and the like, coming back down again. But more recently, we've actually had a resurgence within not only Ohio, but particularly in the western part of the state in Southwest Ohio, as you might have read in the newspaper today. So going back to sort of the onset of this disease in our experience. So when the disease was first introduced, it was introduced in the latter part of March. And what you see, what you may be familiar with, is what's called the R factor. The R factor is a measure of how many people an infected person will infect in turn. So if one infected person infects 2 more people, then the R factor would be 2. If the R factor is above 1, that means that the virus is actually promulgating or propagating and actually spreading in your community. If the R value is less than 1, it means that you have the virus contained. As you can see early on when the virus is introduced, that R factor was over almost 2.5, so that for every infected person, they were infecting 2.5 people in return. We took some dramatic things in terms of clamping down, and you saw a dramatic drop in the R factor. You see in the bottom here on the left-hand corner, I have a few highlights in terms of what happened in terms of response. So right at the time we opened up the health systems, we had a little uptick, but really came right back down into the early part of, into the middle part of May. We had a minimal uptick at the end part of May that people think were maybe related to Mother's Day, came right back down. But then in the middle part of June, again, where the red line is, where the entertainment bars elements started to open up, we did see a marked increase initially in individuals between the ages of 20 and 30, but that later translated into infections in older adults, and we did see, in fact, an uptick in hospitalizations. In fact, our highest number of people hospitalized with COVID was actually in the latter part of July, not at the beginning part of the pandemic. And then once again, you see that we had our mask campaigns and things that really were designed to minimize the spread of the respiratory droplets, and the fact the infection rate came right back down. And this is really much more up to date. This is about 48 hours old. And what you see here in the left upper corner, again, is that R factor. How many, and if it's below 1, it means it's under control. You see that after that uptick in August, we got our R factor back down under 1. We are doing well. We had a little uptick in late August that was primarily in individuals between 18 and 24, and probably did have some to do with the new cases in the young adults on campuses. Fortunately, that group of individuals really does have a very low rate of serious complications, not 0, but very low rate. Came back down. But then you see at the beginning, about 10 days ago, an uptick, and that uptick in cases and associated hospitalizations over the last 10 days has been fairly sustained. And we see both in that our R factors over 1 is 1.3. And actually in the 14 count area, we're higher, and it's about 1.25. The other thing we'd look at then is, well, what percentage of tests are we doing where the patient's positive? Is this just more testing, or is this because people actually have more disease? So the percent of people with positive tests is also an indication of how the disease is spreading. And it had been around almost 5. We dropped down into the latter part of August, around 3. We're doing quite well in our community. But if you notice in the right-hand part, you see these open circles. I can do that right here, which really shows you that over the last several days, we've seen an uptick. And now we're running about 5% of the individuals have positive test results. And this is the data that I share, that it actually correlates, if you will, with with hospitalization. Each one of those blue dots represents a day and the number of people who have been hospitalized at any given point in time. Saw we had a peak right around 160 at the time when the virus was introduced, came right back down. Then we talked about that uptick we had in the latter part of June, had the highest level of hospitalizations, came back down a little blip, but really somewhat almost surprising is that in the last 10 days or so, we've had a fairly dramatic increase in the number of people who are sick enough that with the virus that they've required hospitalization. One of the things I would say is that when we look at that, typically once we got it under control, we would see hotspots where there'd be an outbreak in a nursing home or a prison or a particular factory. What we're seeing now is really pretty diffuse. There's no specific hotspot or cause that we're really seeing about why we've seen this uptick in the last several days, the last couple weeks, as you will. The other thing I will tell you is that we're seeing in both in the region and in the state, more of the cases coming from rural and suburban area rather than the urban core, which was really the multiple hotspots to begin with. And the other way of looking at the burden of the infection is really the number of new cases, or the incidence per 100,000. As you can see, in Hamilton County is 14 per 100,000. Butler County is 22. And again, you can see this up and down, but we really are concerned about this more recent uptick in the number of cases. Interesting enough, Cuyahoga has not had that same sort. They've had a small one, but they've, from a very high peak, have actually been able to bring that back down to just under 6 per 100,000. So there are ways in which we can keep it under control, and you hear it over and over again. It is about washing your hands, disinfecting surfaces, social distancing, and wearing a mask. And this is just the 7-day rolling average. And as you can see, we've gotten better at treating patients. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but we are starting to see a slight uptick in terms of also, unfortunately, the number of deaths, so that recently our average daily number of deaths within the region is about 5 from COVID. Gets back into the response. And one of the things I do think that Ohio should be proud of is the way in which it responded right from the get-go. The governor was very out there very early, really said, we're going to divide in these 8 regions, which are emergency preparedness regions, which we do all the time. But in addition, asked that the state be divided into 3 zones around the 3 C's of Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, so that we had consistency and constant communication between the 3 zones. Early on, when we didn't know much, we really needed to make sure that what people were doing and hearing in Cleveland was consistent with what was happening in Cincinnati. And I've been fortunate enough to serve as the zone lead for Zone 3, the Cincinnati market. I can tell you that early on in the pandemic, all of us from the leaders from the zones were on calls on a daily basis with the Department of Health and coordinating our activity. At first, it was scrambling to make sure we had enough PPE and enough supplies to potential surge, such as ICUs and ventilators. But also, we share best practices and the like. And even today, we have twice a week, all 3 of us get on a call along with the leaders from the Ohio Hospital Association and the governor's office to talk about the issues of the day. And obviously, one of the things that is top of mind is this relative uptick recently, particularly in the western part of the state, as it relates in rural areas. Locally then, which has been a real asset, is that we have, as many of you may know, it's called the Health Collaborative, a long-time organization that brings all the health systems together to really work in a collaborative way. That infrastructure pre-existing this pandemic has served us well. We had a venue of convening us throughout the healthcare organization. Early on, the health systems got together, and the CEOs at an important meeting early on said, listen, for the next X number of months, we're going to be collaborators, not competitors, to make sure that we have the resources available to the community, really living into three principles. First and foremost, that we're going to protect our workforce. Secondly, we're going to make sure that every citizen in the greater Cincinnati area had access to high quality care, and that all of us were going to work together in a transparent way in terms of learning, resources, and coordination to be prepared. After the initial surge, then it was really about us coordinating and making sure we're protecting nursing homes and congregate living. So we added leadership from the congregate living. And then finally, the key element right now is really identifying and isolating cases and doing the case finding, which is the responsibility of the local health departments. So for really at the first time that I know that all three of those elements of the overall healthcare system, of the hospital systems, the congregate living, local health departments meet on a regular basis, communicate, and making sure that we have the resources and understand what's going on as we prepare. As you think then about the COVID, one of the things I'd like to highlight is that we were flying blind in terms of really understanding this virus when it was first introduced in our community. There was not a lot of information. Some of the information coming up overseas and from China was incomplete or frankly at times not accurate. We didn't have a lot of testing, so we definitely were flying the plane without instruments kind of thing. And we have learned a lot since then, and we're going to learn a lot more and as our knowledge expands. I reflect back early on, if I had this phone conversation, I would have told you that only people who have symptoms all people who are infected will have symptoms, and kids can't get infected. We always learn that neither one of those statements are true. But we've learned a lot about how to diagnose it, how to treat it, and obviously the big push here is how we're going to prevent it and ultimately eradicate the virus by having appropriate vaccines in our community. The treatment things has really been a number one elements is really people who've recovered from the infection. We've been collecting plasma. At UC, we've been part of a national study coordinated through the Mayo Clinic about the effectiveness of convalescent antibodies, or people who recovered from the infection, who've developed antibodies and giving them to individuals who have acquired the infection. This is a promising therapy. We realized early on, we gave it to people late in the course of the disease. We now think that maybe giving them early in the course of the disease may actually be more effective. I might add that this is an area which I didn't include here, but with the president's therapy, this is akin to what the president got in terms of the polyclonal antibodies. And that's really the same sort of principle of giving the president antibodies, but rather than coming from people who have recovered, they've been manufactured in a way that hopefully is a little bit more specific. We have antivirals that the one that's most notable is remdesivir, a lot of different elements in terms of devices. The other thing I will tell you that's really changed our understanding about the disease is that one of the unique elements of this infection is that it causes an incredible response by the immune system. And it's really the immune system in overdrive that causes a lot of the complications such as clotting and other organ failure, the heart disease and brain problems that you're sometimes hearing about. And that's where things that we've now understood that to mitigate the inflammatory response with things like steroids has really made a difference. And I can tell you that the people in the front line, both by some data and anecdotally, would tell you that our ability to treat individuals with this cadre of therapies is much more effective than it was 6-8 months ago. Still much to learn along the way. A lot of information about and concern about testing, so I thought I'd take a minute to make sure that I talk about and explain some of the testing that goes on. The gold standard testing is something that's called a PCR test, and it's a polymerase chain reaction. This requires a fair amount of sophisticated equipment as well as technical experience. It is by far the gold standard. It does detect when you're actively infected. It's highly sensitive. There's not very many false negative, and it's highly specific. And it can detect a very low concentration of virus. And frankly, can detect some of the fragments of the virus for even weeks. So there's some ongoing trying to understand about when somebody has cleared the virus in terms of this kind of testing. It takes only about 2 to 6 hours to set up. So if you have the right logistics and flow, we can really get the results back from this highly specific and accurate test in about 2 to 6 hours. Again, this is the kind of testing that was late to our community. Dr. Zander, who is the chair of pathology here at UC, was able to reconfigure some of her research equipment to get some testing available early on in the pandemic. Fortunately, we've had a number of new different platforms to do this kind of test, and we're able to do, and quickly are doing up to about 2,000 tests. We're doing about 24 to 2,500 tests per day in the region as well. The other test that's out there is the antigen test. And this certainly got publicity here when the governor tested positive. And obviously the thing that it highlighted is that the antigen test, it detects active disease again, people who are actively infected, but it's not as sensitive, meaning that it'll miss 10 to 15% of the cases. And as the governor experienced, there's a certain number of false positive, probably in the same neighborhood of 10 to 15%. It's rapid, 15 minutes. It can be done with not a lot of sophisticated equipment, and it's relatively inexpensive. So there's still a role of antigen testing, but obviously it has its limitations. So as we use it for screening and the like, typically people recommend that if you have a positive test, that you get a confirmatory PCR test, if you will, which is exactly what the governor did. And unfortunately, his follow-up testing, a more specific test, was negative. The other thing that you read a lot about, or maybe hearing about, is antibody testing. And what we're doing here is no longer trying to detect the virus that may be in your body, but your immune response to the infection, which means you've been infected and have recovered. Your body in the recovery process will develop these antibodies and occur within about 5 to 7 days of the infection in terms of that. There are false positives. As I mentioned before, the COVID virus is related to other coronaviruses in the family, which include things even like the common cold. So if you've had another kind of coronavirus, it's possible there will be a cross-reactivity leading to a false positive test. And therefore, people, again, just like the antigen test, are using a second test to really confirm that the antibodies are positive, a technique that we're using here at the UC Medical Center to improve the accuracy about the antibody testing. And one of the things I think along the way that has been a challenge, and I think a frustration by everybody, not the least of which is the community, is really having testing widely available and the logistics around it. Not only do you need to have the equipment and the reagents, but you also have to set up the way in which you collect the specimens, that you record people's names so that you can give them their test results. And the whole logistical element of that has been a challenge. It really continues to be a challenge. You know, the Health Collaborative, though, did recently partner with the Hamilton County using some of the CARE dollars to put together a comprehensive program of testing and protecting and really making it much more widely available testing. We're using data to identify hotspots and identify vulnerable populations, particular concern that low income and communities, minority communities and communities of color appear to have a higher incidence, not only of becoming infected, but having complications. So really making sure that we're doing all that we can to identify individuals to stop the spread. Then in this program, we go out and set up screening programs in various settings. You might have read, we're gonna set up an ongoing screening programs or testing sites, both at the YMCA and as well as the libraries. We've also then developed not only sort of testing, but a way in which we use the information to identify hotspots, to make sure that we can have an understanding what's happening about the spread in our community in a really comprehensive way. Again, something that's coming from Hamilton County through the Health Collaborative, and really using some of the expertise from the University of Cincinnati Department of Emergency Medicine, and a model they use to actually manage and test and manage for HIV disease. This is just on a much bigger scale. Obviously, as an academic health system, as I mentioned before, we really have been at the sort of the forefront of thinking about how we actually can respond to the pandemic as we move forward in scientific discovery. See in the right-hand corner down here, Dr. Casella, who is the Chief of Research Services for UC Health, and really UC working together, UC Health working with UC has really been at the forefront. As I mentioned before, we have been enrolled in the convalescent antibody studies. We've been involved in not only the remdesivir trials, but also a number of other new antivirals that are on the horizon to see their effectiveness. Using antivirals that we've used for other viral infections and seeing if there's ways in which we can modify them to make them effective against COVID. One of the other things we've done is a biorepository where we've been collecting specimens and blood from individuals who've been infected with COVID, storing them so that future basic science research can go back and look at these specimens and really have a better understanding about the actual biology and the science behind it, so we can be even more effective, hopefully not only managing COVID, but God forbid if there's any other sort of emergence of a virus that we need to understand. One of the things I will say, and it gets related to the vaccine, is that the scientific knowledge and breakthrough that we've all invested in terms of the last 10 years really has served us well in terms of understanding the scientific community and its understanding about virology or viruses in general has really been highly applicable in terms of understanding how we would respond to this pandemic. Those who've been at the forefront will tell you that the kind of discoveries and what we've learned in the last 7 months historically would have taken years in terms of that, but the infrastructure was there for us to understand. We're involved in studies looking at the comprehensive elements of the infection and stress and well-being. We're doing community studies in terms of where the spread is and how it's spread. And of course, as you may have heard, we've been involved as one of the big vaccine trials moving forward. This is a busy slide. I appreciate that, and I really didn't want to give you any of the detail, but really wanted just to look in the color commentary about the whole host of different studies that we have that are very active right now in terms of us starting up and enrolling individuals. And there's really just, if you will, pages of them in terms of moving forward. Over 100 potential studies that are up and going. We got several of them very active. And in this corner here behind that mask is our own Dean Falak, who's really celebrating a report out on how we're doing in terms of our scientific advances related to COVID. They call it Research Tuesday, and so he is proudly wearing his Research Tuesday T-shirt. And then that gets into the Moderna, the vaccine trial, which is I think one of the most promising vaccine trials here. They need to enroll 3,000 individuals. We were selected because of our expertise as one of 89 places around the country to participate in the study. We will be enrolling 500 individuals. Here to date, we've enrolled over 150 individuals. And depicted here is our very first volunteer with the very first controlled trial of the vaccine from one of our pharmacists, Ms. Burns. And one of the things that has really been a highlight is that we've been visited by the leadership of Operation Warp Speed. This is really the infrastructure from the government that has really been funding and accelerating the development of effective vaccines. And they came to visit us in particular, and not only because of how we brought up our vaccine trials, but one of the things that's important when you do a trial is that you have broad representation of individuals from the community. Will this vaccine be as effective in various different ages and different races and minority and communities? And this is always a challenge of having the diversity within the trials. And one of the things that we've done here in Cincinnati is that we've really led the way in the number of individuals that we've been able to enroll of individuals of color in participation, and a recognition about how important that is. As we start to think about the implementation for the vaccine, a lot of conversations about that. I can tell you again, in my involvement with the state, they're putting together a plan recognizing that a vaccine is going to come. Not clear if it's going to come before the end of the month, but clearly I think it will be some that's available to us certainly by the end of the calendar year. Some of the challenges with the first vaccines that are coming out require 2 doses. So how are we going to track individuals who got the first dose to make sure they get the second dose and get it appropriate? The other thing that's unique is right now it looks like these vaccines need to be kept at a super cold or minus 70 degrees. These super freezers are actually relatively uncommon. They really are usually confined to research centers. We have them here at the University of Cincinnati. But if we need to keep them super cold, the distribution about how we keep these vaccines that cold will be a challenge. There's ongoing recognition that the first wave of vaccines nationwide might be 1 million vaccines become available. That's just a fraction of the need within the community. So how do we prioritize? And again, there's a lot of work that's happening by a lot of the state and local individuals and content experts involved in that. And obviously one of the concerns is that there's been a lot in the press about the speed, which is a good thing, but people want to make sure that in our efforts to get something out there that's effective, that we're not skipping steps in terms of safety and effectiveness. And I can tell you that our leaders and our scientific leaders are maintaining and making sure they're diligent to the principles of science, so that when they say that something is safe and ready, it will be safe and ready moving forward. But overcoming some of the public concerns will be an issue as well. I do want to remind people that it's flu season. I think one of the things maybe I failed to get recognized is that in the United States, there can be over 35 million individuals that get infected. We have almost 500,000 people get hospitalized. And each year we'll have between 20 and 34,000 deaths related to the flu. So a double whammy is something that we want to make sure we avoid. Interestingly enough, one of the things we tend to do is look at what's happening in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere to predict what kind of flu season we're going to have and how well we've predicted with our vaccines. And what you see here is from a collection of hospitals in Australia and the various seasons of number of hospitalizations they have from the flu. If you notice in 2020, they've actually had almost no hospitalizations from the flu. And it's primarily appears to be because all those things about social distancing and masking and preventing the respiratory spread of COVID is also effective in preventing the spread of the flu as well. So I want to switch again, and one of the things that I was asked about is to talk about what's happening at UC Health, and particularly in the Clifton campus, and how it impacts the Uptown community. And one of the things that we really understand is our ongoing need to be the source of hope for our community. What you see depicted here is the launch of our mobile stroke unit. If you suffer from an acute stroke, the longer your brain goes without oxygen because of a clot, the more damage and the permanent damage will cause. So as the neurologists would like to say, is that time is brain. So the faster you can open up a blood vessel, the better the outcome. And what we have here is the ability to dispatch our mobile stroke unit. Within it, it contains a CT scan. So you can do a CT scan on site to make the diagnosis. There's close connection with our neurology experts to really save time in terms of the number of individuals who might be suffering. We launched this in August, and actually the number of dispatches we've had has exceeded what we thought in terms of that, and have had some wonderful stories about really making dramatic changes. Because if you see somebody with a stroke, they can't move their arm, you open up the artery and it's like they wake up. It really is a tremendous advancement. So one of the things that you might know is that last October, we announced a pretty ambitious program about revitalizing the Clifton campus. Included a $220 million commitment to building a new emergency department, as well as some flexible ICUs and expanding our OR capacity. What you see here is some of what we're doing in terms of the emergency department. The left hand here is some of the detail and the planning, but really laying out what we're going to be having in terms of organizing our new emergency department. Some of the planning was put on pause during the early part of the COVID pandemic, but I can tell you that the group in the planning really had continued the work behind the scenes. We're back some of our initial dates have been delayed some, but we're really back in full force moving forward with this project. This is just a depiction of what we think and a rendering of how it's going to look. We're looking down actually Highland Avenue, if you know the campus, in terms of the ED. One of the things about this canopy that we're looking at is not only for design, but also allows some functionality. So if for some reason we'd have a need to have a massive decontamination, we can actually convert this space and seal it off so that we are also responding to any other kind of disaster that might come our way. We're also trying to build in some green space. This is one of the architect's previous projects, really recognizing that the physical environment not only houses the technology and allows people to really do their work in terms of treating individuals, but making sure that we're creating the appropriate kind of healing environment that really fosters not only sort of the immediate treatment, but the whole recovery process. The other thing that we're going to be doing then is right above it, we're going to be actually putting together what is this area right above our emergency room, which will be a flexible ICU. It allows us to take transfers from around the state, as well as expanding our OR to 8 new ORs as well. And this is just the OR expansion here, and again, some shelled space for future expansion. This is the most recent rendering of what we're trying to tie in some of the features that was set with the neuroscience building, the UCGNI building. This over here is the surgery one. We're still working on a rendering on that, but this is some of the early thoughts in terms of what the campus will look like moving forward. And finally, I need just to return that we can't eradicate the virus, we can't hide from it, but we actually can control it, and we do know how to keep it at bay. And at the core of this is that when you're out, it's mask on. So with that, I'll stop, Brooke, and turn it back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all the content you provided. This is very valuable information, and we and the consortium, the Uptown neighborhoods as a whole in Cincinnati are so fortunate to have you and UC Health and all of the resources and expertise right here in Uptown. We're definitely proud to have you all here. So I did want to go over a few Q&A to wrap up our session. That there were some frequent questions submitted by our attendees.
Good.
So the first one was, how is UC Health sharing updated information on COVID-19 widely to the Uptown community? So today is a great example, but I figured you could expand on that.
I just talked to Brooke. Now, I think that one of the things that we have done, it really has been working with all the health systems throughout the region, working through the Health Collaborative, and actually the Chamber of Commerce. The Health Collaborative then entered in with the Chamber of Commerce, and back up a little bit. The Chamber of Commerce got together with the business community to make sure that they started to prepare for the restart of the business community, a program called Restart. The Healthcare Collaborative at the same time was looking at how we managed the pandemic as it hit. We got together and said, listen, one of the most important things is communications. And so we've entered into an agreement between the Health Collaborative and the restart of the Chamber business community in a whole information campaign called RC3. Which is our main vehicle by which we're trying to communicate and educate people, not only what's going on, but also educate the population and frankly, make sure we're sending messages like the importance of social distancing and masking and how we keep our environment safe.
For sure. I'm actually signed up for those regular chamber emails. So maybe I'll include that in my follow-up for those that are not. It's
Good.
A nice update on the number of cases as well as what to look out for forecasting. So that's a great suggestion for our attendees. Another question we had is it advisable to get the COVID-19 test periodically, even if you do not have symptoms?
It's a great question. The recommendation is that it's not necessary. I think a couple things that I would say about the testing. One is the testing will tell you whether or not you are infected today. You can test negative today and actually be infected tomorrow. So one of the things that I think it does help if you're going to get together with somebody or expand your bubble, knowing whether or not anybody in that bubble is infected has some value. You're seeing that with sports teams and the repeated elements of that. So there is some some value to understanding that. However, it's not a guarantee. And so one of the concerns that we have and we've seen is like people go, well, I got tested, I'm negative, and then they become cavalier, not masking, not following their social distancing, which we frankly think is part of the reason we're seeing some uptick in the last couple, people are letting their guard down. So the key element, we want to make sure that we understand the disease. So through the test and protect, we're doing testing throughout the region so that we understand what's happening with this virus in our community. We obviously need to make sure that anybody has symptoms or exposure has an opportunity to be tested. And if in fact you're going to change your contact with other, there is value of it. I think the biggest challenge is making sure we have enough tests available, and that's been the scramble. So there's been a prioritization, and we're getting much better at having it available, but it's still a challenge.
Absolutely. And I know Avondale has had some testing, and Huff and Corryville and Clifton are actually in the process of planning some testing sites now for the neighborhoods in the community.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
the increase is definitely there. So I know you spoke of vaccine trials within your presentation, and we've had some questions for either Uptown community members or businesses that might want to tell their employees about what opportunities are available to sign up for vaccine trials, and how would residents or businesses find out about those?
So the trials, in fact, we should probably disseminate Dr. Casella's information. So if people have any questions about what's happening with all the various trials that you see, he's the point person and really is the opportunity. The Madeira trial we have actually where we're signing up for 500 individuals, it looks like we've actually filled that. And so I'm not sure we're enrolling any additional people. We're in the process of identifying and vaccinating and getting the trial going. So, so that's not readily available, but there are a whole host of other trials out there if people want to become involved. And again, I will share Dr. Casella's number.
Awesome.
I think one of the questions that was asked before is about the role that UC Health might have, and actually once a vaccine is approved. One of the things I will tell you is that we need to figure out a mass vaccine program. But it's likely that the first wave is going to be these 2 doses that's going to require super refrigeration. And we're working right now with the state about how we're going to identify the high priority individuals and how we're going to maintain the super refrigeration. And right now we're, as a research center, we're one of the few places that have those kind of freezers. So there probably will need to be involved, but ultimately we're going to have the ability to to vaccinate the masses, and that will be through multiple vehicles, not the least of which will be the health departments.
I'm sure. And then we've also had questions submitted, about the flu season and their traditional flu vaccine. Some questions were submitted around the effectiveness period and when is the best time to get the vaccine. I know you would probably say today, tomorrow, now, but the best time to get the flu vaccine as we enter the winter season.
Yeah, it's certainly thought to be best to get it before November 1st. And so the earlier the better. It takes about 2 weeks for your immunity to build up as the result of the vaccine. One of the things that is true about the flu is that the virus changes a little bit year to year. And so we have to guess. And so from year to year, there's also some variation about how effective it is. But even when it's not a quote perfect match, there is still real protection of if not preventing the infection, but certainly reducing the likelihood of complications. It will last through the spring period of time. One of the questions I've been asked, because it's so important, is if I get it now, do I need to have a booster, if you will, in February to like? And the answer is no, that the science really looks like once you get a vaccine, that it's good for the season and through the end of the flu season is like. But we definitely, earlier is better. So I'm glad to hear that you got it a week ago, Brooke, and everybody needs to get it. So good.
Great. And then our last question to wrap us up today, because you really did cover so much in your presentation, and I think you answered a lot of the questions that were submitted, but has UC Health had to postpone any major projects because of COVID? I know the emergency department renovations seem to be continuing, but have there been any other major projects that have had to be postponed?
I think there's 2 things that happened in the healthcare. One is from a business standpoint, so I know I have a lot of business leaders here, is that when we shut down our normal non-COVID care, it actually had a profound effect on our business. Like a lot of other businesses, it really dramatically reduced our revenue. And so there was some pause about as we started to get prepared for the recovery period of time and how we were saving capital, that we delayed some of the projects and some of the renovation pieces. Interesting enough, though, we went out and got the funding we needed for the renovation. I mean, for the ED project, and that major project is moving forward. We have a lot of ambitious ideas, and some of them we'll put on pause, but we're back really thinking that what we need to do to make sure that we continue to live into the real important elements of bringing unique and destination programs to our community.
Great. Well, that's really good to hear. And I think as a community as a whole, we're excited that we can see progress with some of the renovations and additions, and as well as the expertise that UC Health brings to our neighborhoods. So I just want to thank you for giving your time today and speaking to our neighborhoods. I also want to thank our business leaders as well as neighborhood representatives, small businesses, and organizations for joining and for tuning in. So thank you everyone for joining. This wraps up today's session, and we will actually be posting this to our YouTube page for anyone that wants to see it after the session. So thank you, Dr. Lofgren.
Thank you all, and I thank all my neighbors and colleagues. I appreciate it spending some time today, and even if it's flat screen rather than 3D, but we'll get back to 3D at some point. So thank you.
Exactly. Thank you.